Great. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Cindy Grove, and I'm the director of the Rockport Library. I am so glad that you could join us this evening for our online event. Tonight is the historical context for the Russian-Ukraine war. This presentation will offer historical examination of the Ukrainian national identity from its origins in the Kievan Russia to relations between Ukraine, Russia, and the West that brought us to this current war. David M. Kalivas, Ph.D., currently serves as the Senior Adjunct Professor of History of the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Prior to his retirement, he was a full-time professor of history at the Middlesex Community College for nearly 40 years. For the last 13 years of his career at the college, he served as founding director of the Commonwealth Honors Program. His teaching and research interests cover a broad range of topics in world history, with specialties in the history of racism, religion, and cross-cultural interactions. David has a Ph.D. from Northeastern University, a master's from the University of Connecticut, and a bachelor's degree from Suffolk University. I again want to thank everybody for being here this evening. I also want to thank the Friends of the Rockport Library for sponsoring our events, and encourage you to please check out to the library's website for any other upcoming events that you may be interested in and want to jump in and register for. So thank you, David, for being with us today, and I will pass the screen over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy, for both inviting me and hosting me this evening. And thank you for everyone who has taken the time out of their busy lives to be here tonight. What we'll try to do tonight is in 1 hour is much too much, of course. There's too much to do, too much to engage on this topic, but we'll do our best. And what I'm hoping we can accomplish tonight is just have a discussion about the war in Ukraine and what the issues are that really about that war, how we got to this really place. I have some slides. I'm going to share them in a moment. I will go through a presentation, and then I'm going to leave probably about 20 minutes. So I'm hoping to talk no more than 35, 40 minutes, and then have time for some questions and discussion. Those are always the famous last words for academics. They tell you they're going to talk no more than 35 to 40 minutes, and then you really have to get the hook to get them off the stage after an hour. I will try not to live up to that reputation. I really will do my best to keep this as brief, but providing some context and providing some perspective for us to consider. I think that the issue about the war in Ukraine, when we think about what's going on today, we really have to have a moment here, just to pause for a moment, really, to think about the gravity of what we're about to talk about tonight. And the gravity of the situation couldn't be more dire. Russia invades Ukraine in February of 2022. Here we are a little more than a year later, with tens of thousands of lives lost, whole cities, multiple cities demolished, devastated, lives wrecked and ruined, a country in the midst of utter devastation because of the Russian invasion. But it's not the first invasion. It is the second invasion. The first invasion, of course, was in 2014, and we'll talk a bit about that. So when thinking about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we just can't look at 2022. There was 2014, and approximately 15,000 lives lost in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine in the Donbass and Luhansk region, in the eastern regions of Ukraine that were occupied in 2014, 2015, and including Crimea. So this has been going on for quite a while. And the issues that come up for us is why? Why did this happen? And what are some of the major issues that we'll try and look at tonight? And some of them are is, how do we understand history? How does an understanding of history play into the causation for a war? So we'll try and answer that question with some information. Are there issues of ethno-national identity at play here? We'll try and tease them out to see how they're a factor in the war. And are there security concerns? Are there security concerns for Russia that led Russia to invade in 2014 and prop up two people's republics, the people's republics of in the Donbass region of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions? Are there issues of security for Russia to create this zone in the eastern part of Ukraine and in Crimea? That its security is the reason that it invaded, or as Putin said, launched the special military operation, which is simply euphemistic language for invasion and war. So are there legitimate security concerns for the Russians? Are there security concerns for the Ukrainians? Are there security concerns for Eastern Europe? Are there security concerns for Europe in general? Or is it only the security concerns for Russia? So we're going to try to tease out some of these issues in tonight's session. And there may be others along the way as well. And if you have questions, please, put them into the chat and we'll address them when I finish the presentation. Now, let me share the screen. Oops. So you can all see this. Cindy, you're viewing the title page?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I'd like to do is I would like to begin with some source material. Evidence is important in reaching conclusions. All too often today, it seems to me that we are fancy and footloose with our conclusions without much evidence. And I think it's important. And I think that to have evidence, these authors and these particular works, if you want to engage this topic of the Russian-Ukrainian war further, I urge you to look at these authors. I won't spend long on this, but just briefly, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine by Serhiy Plokhy is tremendous. It's something that I highly recommend to understand this broad history of Ukraine going back into the 10th century. On the left, Anne Applebaum's, anything by Anne Applebaum is really good. This one is on the Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, the Holodomor, which was the forced hunger and essentially murder by hunger of millions of people in the Ukraine in the early 30s. Excellent work to understand that period. Timothy Snyder, you can Google Timothy Snyder. He has a whole course on the history of Ukraine from Yale that's online, and you can watch the whole thing free of charge on YouTube. And this one is Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Excellent work. On the bottom right is an analytical work by Paul Deneri, a political science professor, Ukraine and Russia from Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War. These are great works. Now, I've put Owen Matthews, a journalist, on the right, Overreach. I've actually just started reading it. I'm just into the second chapter. I usually don't put something up until I can finish the whole thing, but so far it's really a phenomenal work, I think, and one that's very accessible for the general reader. So I'm recommending these works to you. All right, here we are. This is the map of what it looked like in late February, early March 2022, when Russia invaded the Ukraine. The areas in the red show Russian control, and the areas with the red lines and even the orange areas, all of these colored areas show the Russian invasion as it began. And when the Russian invasion began in February of 2022, we all thought, frankly, that within a matter of days, the Russian army, the Russian tank divisions, the Russian armed forces would seize Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, within days. No one thought it was going to last. Well, here we are today. or pretty close to today. This map showing where the counteroffensive in blue of the Ukrainian armed forces pushing out, and the Russian armed forces. And you can see these arrows are showing where the fighting is going on, in the major counteroffensive that was launched by the Ukrainian armed forces, pushing the Russians out. And this is where we are today, pretty close to today. This shows us where the contested zones are and continue to be, and we don't know what's going to happen. But I just thought I'd give you a sense. The war has been going on over a year. The notion that it was just going to be a lightning strike of the Russian armed forces and overrunning Ukraine obviously hasn't played out at all. But let's take a moment and think about this war. Why did it happen? Where are the roots for this war? And I think the roots lie in both the understanding of history, the understanding of ethno-national identity, and in really an attempt to reclaim lost territory. And you know, there are many folks who will argue back and forth that there were significant issues at play for Russian security that created this war. I'm not so sure about that, but there are also folks that will say, and in fact, one of those people who will say that Russian and Ukrainian identity are one and the same is Vladimir Putin. In several years ago, he wrote a rather significant paper on the history of Russia and Ukraine. And in that statement, he essentially is saying is that there is no real Ukrainian identity, that the identity of the Ukrainians is the same as the identity of the Russians, that they are a common heritage, a common people, and that the greatest catastrophe in geopolitics, Putin argued, was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that you know, reclaiming territory in the Ukraine is really reclaiming Russian territory. And so let's see how that plays out here. When we go all the way back in time to the 10th century, we're essentially looking at something called Kievan Rus. And Kievan Rus, oops, there we go. Okay. Here we go. So this is what, you know, the map as we see it today with Ukraine, Belarus, and you can see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Russian Federation, Eastern Europe. Kievan Rus occupied this huge tract of land here, stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltics. And this area in the 10th century, in the 10th and the 11th into the 12th century, was a sizable kingdom. In fact, at one point, the rulers of Kievan Rus were marrying their daughters off to different kingdoms and principalities, in forming dynastic relationships with European kingdoms and principalities, as well as the Byzantine Empire. And who the people were that came and formed Kievan Rus, I'm just going to try to be quick with this, essentially the Varangians, or as we would call them, the Vikings, the Scandinavians, the Swedes, essentially, and coming in and settling in this area here, and interacting over time with the people in this region, and forming this society and this polity called Kievan Rus, around the capital of Kiev, as you can see here. And what's important here to realize for us is that they developed significant relations with the Byzantine Empire, significant relations with the other European kingdoms. But Kievan Rus, I like this slide because it says, you know, up here, Kievan Rus, Russia was born here. And another one says Kiev, and it has Ukraine is born here, is another slide. And what you know, the idea is this where the Ukrainian and the Russians come from, the same area of Kievan Rus, or is it something different? And so In 2016, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin had this statue erected right next to the Kremlin wall. This is the statue of Saint Vladimir the Great. And it's Putin isn't stylizing himself as a medieval warrior here. Maybe you could make a case that, Saint Vladimir the Great and Vladimir Putin, that he likes it. I don't know. But the point is that what we have here in this statue is a huge statue built to commemorate the first ruler of Kievan Rus, who adopted Christianity and establishes a dynasty that will last with with a succession of rulers, and that will create this polity developing as a major state in the European world from the roughly the 10th into the 12th centuries. That will be the genesis for Ukrainian culture, as it also reaches out into the emergence in the 1200s and the 13th century of Muscovy. And in Ukrainian, Saint Vladimir the Great is referred to as Saint Volodymyr. And of course, it is looking at the first ruler of Volodymyr, who would not even have called himself that. He would have been using a Viking language of the time to refer to himself. Ukrainian, or neither Ukrainian nor Russian, had developed at that point into the modern languages we think of them as today. It was the very beginning. But Putin built this huge statue, and I want to show you a clip of the consecration of this statue. It's in 2016, right outside of the Kremlin wall, and it really gives us a window into Putin's worldview when it comes to Ukrainian identity. So just bear with me. So I'm going to forward this a bit because it's all in Russian, but you can see that there's the Kremlin wall.
We don't see it yet.
Oh.
Did you see your slides?
You don't see it, huh?
No, we're just seeing the slide that has the two links.
Okay. It worked when we were doing it before, of course.
It did. It just worked a few minutes ago.
Can you see it now?
Nope, we see a black screen now.
All right, let me try it again.
Zoom always gives us a little obstacle every time.
Okay. And nothing, right?
Right now, we're just seeing you. You have to share your screen again.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
Okay. And now?
The black screen again.
I don't understand. All right, well,
I don't either.
let's see.
Everyone, we did a practice run and it worked like about 10 minutes ago. So.
All right. I'm going to give up in a minute. It was really a nice thing to. All right. So one last time. And now?
Nope. Unfortunately not.
Okay. Okay. Okay, you can't see anything, huh?
Nope.
All right. That's fine. I don't want to take any more time. And you see now, do you see the screen?
Yep, now we see the screen. Yep, with the map. Now it's the orange screen with the,
Yeah, you see St. George slaying the dragon?
we sure do.
All right, so let me just pick up with this. Well, what I was trying to show us was the consecration ceremony of the statue of Saint Vladimir the Great, who was the founder of Kievan Rus, and really established the founding dynasty for what would later become Ukrainian identity and history and language, and that eventually would shape the emergence of Muscovy up in the northern city-state of what we call Moscow today, after the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and 14th century. And eventually Moscow will emerge, and this is the patron saint of Moscow. And then Muscovy will take a trajectory all of its own, where what we think of as modern day Russia will emerge around the expansion of Muscovy gradually in the 13th, 14th, 15th, all the way into the early 17th century, when in the early 17th century, the Romanov dynasty will emerge. Russia will take on a very significant identity. And then we get, of course, into the late 17th, early 18th century with Peter the Great, and then of course, a successor later on in the 18th century, Catherine the Great, that really will create the imperial Russian polity that will expand into and include all of what we think of the Ukraine and the Crimea as we move into the 19th century. And so what I wanted to show you is Vladimir Putin giving a speech, first of all, having this statue, which is the patron saint for the Ukrainians, and having a huge ceremony with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, consecrating it, and with multiple speeches. But in Putin's speech, he is very significantly referring to Saint Volodymyr, or Vladimir the Great, as someone who was a precursor to the development of a strong, centralized Russian state. And he uses that language in his speech. And what's important about this is that he is now stretching all the way back 1,000 years and claiming the Russian identity and around the consecration of a Ukrainian saint. And there's also a huge statue to Saint Volodymyr, of course, in the Dnieper River that slices through Kiev. And yet he is proclaiming this as a Russian saint. And it's important because he's playing fancy-free and footloose with history, and he's recreating history. And we don't have time to get into the Mongol Empire, but it is after the expansion of the Mongol Empire into Eastern Europe, including what we think of as Ukraine and Russia today, that we will see the emergence of Muscovy. This same area during the 16th into the 18th century, of course, will, when we think of Ukraine, you can see Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, and Estonia, and Latvia. We can see this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So Russia, you can see to the east, but there was this huge period of time when there were other states in this region. Kievan Rus, then we'll have the post-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Eventually, when we get to the 20th century, the end of the Russian dynasty of the Romanovs, the emergence of the Soviet Union, and again, during the early period of the Soviet Union, around 1922, there will be the creation, not just of the Soviet Union, but of an autonomous Ukrainian republic that for a time in the 1920s will be heralding its own culture, Ukrainian language side by side with Russian. But by the late 30s, by the early 30s into the late 20s, when Russia is going through this process of collectivization and ending all privatization onto collective state farms, Stalin will institute a policy that today has come to be known as the Holodomor. In 32, 33, as a way to get rid of and decapitate, many argue, Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian nationalist movement in the Ukrainian Republic or the Autonomous Republic of the Soviet Union, and to sell grain on the open market for hard currency for buying the tractors and the mechanization materials needed for mass collectivization, which was industrializing Russia in the late 20s, early 30s. Grain will be sold that could have been used for people in Ukraine, and there will be millions of people who will die during this forced famine. And so this also begins to shape identity in the Ukraine, an identity that is not in conjunction with Russian identity. It's going to be there. And I just want to throw that to you to think about a little bit. And I'm going to move it along, and then we'll make sense of all of this as we move on. By the time we get to the late 80s, of course, into 1991, it's a period when we think, oh, everything is going to be resolved. There'll be no more conflict in the region. Okay, long history. We're coming up to this. It's a new age of independence. We see Gorbachev and the first Bush here, the end of the Soviet Union, the emergence of democratic figures, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, you see in the second figure on the tank, after the putsch in August of 1991, when there was an attempt to stop the changes of Gorbachev's Soviet Union. That ends. You see in the bottom left the massive demonstrations in Maidan Square in Kiev, as the Kiev is essentially declaring its independence in 1991, and it's a new era has dawned. Well, is it? So there are some legacies here, and the Russian Federation, one of those legacies is security, and one of those legacies is claiming a historical a legacy, claiming an ethnic, a national legacy, but also a legacy of security concerns. When we look at the border areas between Russia and Eastern Europe, it's clear that Russia is saying, we were invaded by the Nazi Germany, we were invaded by the Kaiser's Germany, we were invaded by Napoleon. And so we have real security concerns because now there's NATO, and what we've seen happen is that in the early 90s, when it seemed the Cold War was over, and what began to happen as the former states of the Soviet Union declared their independence, they begin to join the EU, and as we can see in the bluish color, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all joining the EU and NATO. And of course, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova have not. And throughout the 2000s into the period of the 2010 until 2022, there are some who argue that Putin was saying, look, if NATO continues to expand, if they expand to our border, it represents a security threat. We will not allow Ukraine to become a part of NATO. In fact, we will not allow it in terms of its westward expansion. And in 2013-14, the Ukraine under Yanukovych, who was the president at that time, will go to Vilnius in Lithuania to sign an agreement positioning Ukraine to come into the EU, the European Union. It was an agreement of economic cooperation. Yanukovych, who actually was very much a supporter of a Russian supporter, a Russophile, and very much looking to lean Ukraine toward Russian policies. Many argue was supported by the Russians, and when he gets to Vilnius in 2013, he doesn't sign it. Putin's Russia threatened a trade war, and essentially he decided there was too much pressure on the Russian side. Yanukovych did not sign it, goes back to Kyiv, faces a huge outpouring on the streets, because also Yanukovych in 2014 was, the fear was leaning toward developing a more authoritarian government. That did not play out. Certainly, though, he did order security forces to fire on the crowd. There were, we don't know the exact number, of over 100 dead, and then a huge outpouring into the streets. And Yanukovych flees, and he still is residing in Russia today and goes into exile in Russia. Then you see Poroshenko and eventually Zelensky becoming elected president, and Ukraine leaning westward again. Now, what's important here to realize, I think, is that this leaning westward, you could argue, is the right of an independent country to make a decision about. Imagine. So there are security concerns, and those security concerns are not only Russia's. They are also, it's an armed border. The security concerns also have to do with the needs, with the needs of all of the former Eastern European countries that were once part of the Soviet Union and forcefully brought into the Soviet Union after World War II. And in some regard, the notion that the only security concerns are those of Russia seem to get lost in the security concerns of the Eastern European countries, including Ukraine. Now, when the Ukrainian independence was proclaimed in '91, here you see Kravchuk, Yeltsin, and the American president, oh my goodness, Clinton, in 1991, after the proclamation of the independence of Ukraine, but also in the establishment. I believe this was after the Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994. And in 1991, the Soviet Union is dissolved. The CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, is established. Ukraine, along with Belarus and Russia, are founding states. Ukraine never becomes a full member of the Commonwealth of Independent States. It never became an economic partner or a military partner. It did not want to lose the independence. It was just now getting, and that was independence politically and culturally from Russia. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in the 1997 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, signed by Russia, guaranteeing the sovereignty of Ukraine and guaranteeing, of course, Ukraine guaranteeing that it will give up nuclear weapons. And so, along with, of course, the Ukrainian independence in 1991, what we have to look at that is how did that Ukrainian independence come to be? There was a referendum in 1991, and the referendum, as you can see here, 92.3% approved Ukrainian independence, not becoming a full member of a new union of the former states of the Soviet Union. And if you look at this map, even, of course, the western areas of Ukraine absolutely heavily vote overwhelmingly. In the eastern areas, where we see, of course, more Ukrainian and Russian ethnicities at play. So if we look at the eastern part of the Ukraine, where you can see it's 86%, 83, 83%, 90, 90, 54%. Of course, 54% is the Crimea. In the regions that you can see, the 86, 83 percentage areas, those are the regions that are the contested areas coming down to that swing down in where it is 90% of 83%. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but these regions what in 2014, along with, can you see the cursor here? Well,
Yes, we can.
This is the Crimea on the bottom, and this region here are the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. These were established after the Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea here. And these were established in 2014-15 as the People's Republic of Luhansk and the People's Republic of Donetsk in what is referred to as the Donbass region, and which is the hotly contested area that you saw in the first maps. And this region here, even though the majority of the population are ethnically Russians, still overwhelmingly voted for independence. So this is an important factor. And so the notion that somehow, 20 some odd, almost 30 years later, 30 years later, that somehow there was no legitimacy to the referendum and no legitimacy to the Ukrainian independence doesn't have its roots in anything that's real. But what happens here is that there are the separatist movements that emerge in the Luhansk and the Donetsk People's Republics that were annexed by Russia, of course, after they began their invasion in February of 2022. So now Russia has annexed this entire region, proclaiming it as Russian territory now. Russia, for the past essentially 10 years, has been funding and fomenting and helping orchestrate the so-called civil war and the war for liberation of Russian independence in these regions and to rejoin the Russian motherland. Now, the issue, though, is that the pink region, starting from 2014 to the present, is in Russian, it's Novorossiya, right here. Novorossiya, well, this notion that this is a new Russia, that this is a part of Russia. Ukraine is up here in the green, but this has always been New Russia. That actually terminology dates all the way back to Catherine the Great. So it's nothing new. Putin is using a very old playbook for essentially proclaiming this entire region as Russia. And now, can a case be made? Sure, a case can be made. Once you occupy it, you've made your case. What would happen, of course, if a legitimate referendum would be done again in these regions? Well, we won't know, because there has been nothing legitimate. The referendum in 2014 that seized Crimea was 98 or 99%. They wanted to stay. And the issue with Crimea is that in the 40s, there was another population in the Crimea, the Tatars. Now, the Tatars were forcefully deported by Stalin to Central Asia. So there has been not just many identities and ethnic groups in these regions, but the most important part, I think, for us to understand is what emerges as an independent Ukrainian state in 1991. What was the policies of that Ukrainian state in wanting to join both NATO and the European Union, and how does the desires, how does the policies of an independent Ukrainian state have a role in determining how an independent Ukrainian state establishes its relations versus the needs of Russia. When Russia proclaims this as a special military operation in February of 2022, saying they will not occupy all of Ukraine, of course, that immediately is thrown up into the air, because the attempt was to steamroll all the way into Kyiv and to decapitate the Zelensky government and to take control of the essentially entire country. Why else do you steamroll into a position of quickly sending your army to take the capital city. And so we have to be really careful when we're looking at ideas of Russia's security concerns, not to forget about Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. So I just wanted to offer this quickly and to throw it open to some discussion where we can perhaps tease out some of the major issues. But at this point, I think I'll stop and just open the floor up to some questions. I intentionally went quickly, and we're already at almost 7:15, but I wanted to give time to just introduce some ideas about Ukrainian history, separate from Russia, about security concerns, not only being those of the Russians, about the differences between Ukrainian national identity, language, and remember, Ukrainian and Russian are sort of like English and Dutch, I guess you could say. There's yes, some of the same lettering, obviously. You could hear some words, you can maybe pick up things. They're not the same language and not the same history. And so yet what's being presented to us is that the Russians are coming in, and they, by the way, they did expect people to come out into the streets and see the Russian army as it invades in February 2022 as liberators, and they did expect to take Kyiv in a matter of within a matter of days, frankly, within 2 weeks. And they thought that the population, we're told, particularly in the East, was going to welcome them. That did not happen at all. And so the war is continuing to grind, continuing to literally grind the lives out of so many. And recent developments, of course, with China and Xi coming in to visit with Putin, and with the so-called peace plan. We can always talk about that too. All right, I'll stop there and let's have a discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, so folks, feel free to put your questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's no question in terms of the Rurik dynasty. Yeah, I didn't get into the details of the dynasty at all, and nor into what comes after, essentially Vladimir, and that wasn't his name back then either. If we had just focused on medieval Kyiv, and we would never get to anything else. So thank you for the minor correction. It's important, but I just didn't get into that. But are there any questions at all? Well, while you're thinking of one, I can tell you this, just to focus on this, is that when you look at Kievan Rus, think about this. I mean, we probably don't think about this too often, but Kievan Rus, the ruling dynasty, were essentially Scandinavian, and so the language that they're speaking and the culture that's developing amongst the ruling class had not even yet integrated with whoever the local peoples, the Slavs, in that region. And so initially they were the conquerors, they were the dominant group, and it's only in time that they will become integrated and then emerge as part of that population. But the importance for us today is really to understand, I think, the way it's as if I'm going to say, let me think of a good parallel. That I am, this may not be a good parallel, but we're the Canadians, and we're going to say, we're going to come in and invade the Northeast and take New England. And then we're going to say that because there was some connection down the road a bit, because we both settled here from England and from France, and there were French and English settlers in the region, that somehow the history of New England is our history. Now that may be too simplistic, but that's essentially what's going on right now, proclaiming that somehow Kievan identity, Ukrainian identity that developed over a period of 1,000 years. And by the time we get to the 19th century, by the way, in the 1860s, the Russian dynasty of the time, the Romanovs, by the 1860s, outlawed Ukrainian because of the developing identity around Ukrainian in the region of Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire at a time when in the 19th century, nationalism was a major issue in the European world, of course, and in the world. And so the Romanov dynasty couldn't have Ukrainian nationalism developing. And when you have your own language and culture, that gives way to a national identity that eventually can become a political challenge to the established order. So that's just another indication of how Ukrainian identity was developing over time. Now, do you see a path to a political solution at this point? Let me get some water. You know, I don't. I keep hoping there would be one. And again, this is an area that I have developed an interest over the years, and I traveled greatly in the late Soviet Union and the Russian Federation in the early to mid 90s on when I was doing work on Russian studies more specifically, and who knows what can happen? Anything is, but as long as the Russians, as long as Putin's Russia will not leave Ukrainian territory right now, I don't see a solution. Now, what can happen after? Again, I don't want to get into the, predicting. I don't know what's going to happen. Will the Ukrainians launch a massive? Will they have the ability to launch a major counteroffensive? Will they have the ability to rout the Russian forces and push them back? And will the death toll eventually cause Putin's Russia to realize they had better have a political solution? I don't know. You've already had more Russian deaths in addition to the tens of thousands that we've seen now with Ukrainian deaths, but more Russian deaths than in essentially all the years the Russians were in Afghanistan in such a short period of time. So, and Putin has essentially tightened up. He's ended any hopes of democratic reforms. They were all ended in between 2005 and 2007 in a significant way. By the time we get into the period between 2010 and 2020, essentially up until last year, Putin has ended any real hopes of any freedom of the press. One of the last major journalists, her name slips me now, but she finally fled in I think it was August, September of last year, and is in New York now. He's arrested his opposition or killed them, and has created obviously an authoritarian system. So it's hard to say at this point. Whenever you did have several thousand people protesting the war, you did have thousands flee the conscription for the mobilization last year, and but there have been thousands who have protested, thousands who have been arrested. So it's a very one of the things you have to understand about Putin is that Putin doesn't believe in people power. Or let me put it to you this way: for Putin, demonstrations into the streets that can create the people power of the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of protests that can paralyze, if you would, a government and force it to act or flee. He doesn't want that to happen. He saw what happened to Yanukovych, who was the president, the Russian-leaning president in 2013, who fled to Russia after refusing to sign the EU document. He saw what happened with people power, and Putin was a KGB major in 1990-91 in Dresden, in Eastern Germany, when thousands of people, of the East Germans, are coming onto the streets, And eventually, East Germany will eventually, the government will collapse. Well, what Putin saw is that if you don't hammer down the people power right away, it can mushroom. And so he saw that, and he has essentially said in so many words and so many speeches that that's not what's going to happen in Russia. And so he has been ferocious and fierce and vicious in his cracking down. So you know, unless there is something that breaks that's going to convince him that he needs to change course, and I don't think it's happening with mass demonstrations in any of the major Russian cities right now, because he's going to stamp them right out. Unless something else happens, he's going to continue to unleash the brutality he is unleashing, is what I'm thinking. And the only way I think that he can be stopped is if, and the problem with this is it could create the kind of carnage where the victory is Pyrrhic, where there are no victors. And that's a really dangerous situation for the Ukraine. So it all depends on what's going to be launched and what they're going to do militarily. And will that be able to create a situation for coming to the table? Because right now, Putin would love nothing better than a ceasefire and to gather up time to replenish his resources. And that's not what the Ukrainians want to do at all. And so, you know, you could argue that can the Zelensky government, can the Ukrainian government just chalk it up that, look, in order to have peace, they have to, is one of the questions here is, in order to have peace, you just have to realize that you're going to let go of the eastern regions and the Crimea. But at this point, it's easy for us to say, at this point, that doesn't seem to be what the Zelensky government or the Ukrainians want. And what we have to realize is the Donbass region, of course, is the industrial region as well. And so, and of course, the Crimea, with all of its ports, is also significant. But again, so I don't see any movement. I mean, everything that we've heard from the Ukrainian government has been no. We're in this, and at this point, the Russians have not been successful. It's been over a year, and they haven't steamrolled over and conquered the Ukraine, have they? So I don't know what's going to happen. Now, the potential for a hot war spilling over into the borders is frightening. It certainly is frightening. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, they're difficult questions to answer because we don't know what will happen. But what we've seen happen so far is that Putin's Russia launches this war, and the question has to come even in back to 2014. Why? What has happened as a result? There were some minimal sanctions, you can say comparatively in 2014, 2015. For the annexation of Crimea, but then it seemed, well, things were getting back, you know, to normal. We eventually are going to get going with trade again. This time around, though, you know, what has Putin done? Putin has said that NATO expansion is what we're invading because we can't have any more NATO expansion. What has happened? NATO has solidified, has unified in a way NATO has not been unified in years. Finland is coming to NATO. Sweden has applied for NATO membership. We'll see whether Erdogan in Turkey is trying to block the Swedish entry into NATO. But right now, it looks like Finland definitely coming into NATO. Sweden probably eventually coming into NATO. He's brought Sweden and Finland, two countries that have maintained neutrality all these years since World War II, and two countries that have purposely maintained their neutrality coming into NATO and under the NATO umbrella, where Article 5 can essentially, you know, the clause where when one NATO country is attacked, we will all respond. He's unified them. Putin has done something that the United States has never been able to do. He's getting Germany And now the European states increasing their defense budgets. They're increasing their defense budgets. They're arming themselves in a way they haven't done since World War II. He is creating a much more militarized zone against Russia. The sanctions are significant. The Russian economy, in terms of consumer goods, I mean, the Russian economy, I don't mean to be flip with this, but how many household items do you have made in Russia? No, I mean, if you pick up a cup, it'll say made in China. This one probably is too, for all I know. But plenty of our products made in China, right? You don't see made in Russia. You see made in Cambodia, made in Vietnam, not made in Russia. Even the Matryoshka, I had got some Matryoshka dolls from my grandson, were made in China, which I found the nesting dolls. Now, luckily, I have a whole bunch from my travels over there years and years ago. But anyway, the point is, the Russian economy is not a major producer. It has petro, it has gas, that's its major resources. They're having a shortage of consumer goods. I mean, so the Russian economy is hurting. Russia's becoming, sure, not isolated with China, not isolated with India, but isolated from the West that it was integrating more into. So this has been hurting Russia. So why do all this? Is the big question. Why wreck your economy? NATO was not going to invade Russia. That was never there. And I know there are some analysts that are saying, well, Putin has been saying, nope, you expand the NATO countries. That's it. I'm drawing the line with Ukraine. Well, the question emerges: does Eastern Europe and Ukraine have legitimate security concerns when it comes to Russia? I should say the Russian invasion legitimizes the security concerns, and so why they launched this, I think, has everything to do with this notion of reclaiming Russian lands, a notion of Russian identity as the identity, that there is no Ukrainian identity, and that we are going to redo an era that when the Soviet Union dissolved, it took the heartland out of Russia, and we're taking that heartland back. And that heartland, from the perspective of the Russian regime, is Ukraine. And I think that otherwise, why wreck your position and economy? Why do all that? It doesn't make any sense to me. Even the argument, and I know I can hear some of my colleagues telling me, "Oh no, when Baker, when the Secretary of State Baker, back in the 90s, when the Soviet Union dissolved, Baker promised that Gorbachev, or his foreign minister, I think it was Shevardnadze, I can't remember exactly, that NATO would not expand eastward." You know what? Baker's not the Secretary of State. He's not around. He's not the Eastern European countries, and NATO has always been, as it expanded, defensive. And so the idea that that's the rationale, I'm sorry, given the history of Russian oppression of the Ukraine, and given the history of Russian and during the Soviet period occupation and oppression of the Eastern European states, and its history with trying to squelch and crush Ukrainian identity. No, I think it has everything to do with the designs of Putin to bring back the Russian, his perception of the Russian homeland, playing to the right-wing Russian nationalist audience that is used to be more and more on the fringe, that is now becoming mainstream and dominant in Russia, and he's played up to that, is what's happening now. And we can get into the Wagner Group with Prigozhin if you like, but we're running out of time. If you had a question about that, and the emergence of private armies in Russia now, that is beginning to emerge, and what that means with the Russian oligarchs. Anyway, I don't know your question there. Does it ever make sense to offer territory for peace? Yeah, the idea is he wouldn't be satisfied perhaps with just the East. And the only reason I'm saying that is because he already attempted to launch into Kyiv and take over the Ukrainian capital. There's so much here. And in the 1 hour we've had together, my attempt was to just quickly introduce some issues, try and get to some questions, have some discussion. What we really need is, several sessions, of course, to really engage. And then I can assign you readings too, and then we can really engage the topic. But I hope you've taken something useful away at this time. And thank you for your patience, and thank you for your participation. Any other questions? I could go on, of course, and that people have to go home, and I understand. But if you had any last questions, now's your time. Otherwise, thank you for your patience with my presentation.
Like that's it. But that was outstanding. Thank you so much.
And thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't get the clip to work. That would have been, it was very powerful and moving, and then to hear Putin's words, I paraphrased them, but to hear him saying them, it was just phenomenal. But all right, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want, if you email me the links, I'll email all the attendees the links to the video so they can watch them.
So I'll email the links. One of them, just so you know, has the oh my God, the closed captioning in English that has his speech. So that's good. The other one is just Russian. It did not have a translation, but I was going to explain it as we moved along. But just to hear it and to see the pageantry, if you would, and then what was the meaning behind it. So I'll send them to you.
Great.
Excellent. Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Well, thanks, Cindy. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.